Hi guys, today we're going to be making this heart shawl or triangle scarf, whatever you would like to make. You could also make it a little bit smaller, maybe use a smaller hook and turn it into a bandana. I think that would be very nice as well. But otherwise, this is just my little piece that I built up for the tutorial, but you can see from the pictures I made a larger one for a triangle scarf, and if you keep working up the same 9-row repeat that I'm about to show you in the tutorial, you can make this as large as you would like. So the height here will keep growing and also the width will get wider and wider. So you can make a nice big large shawl, a triangle scarf like you see in those photos, or whatever you would like. And the materials that I used for this shawl is this Caron Blossom Cakes. And the one I have here is in the color Passion Fruit, but you can feel free to use any kind of medium 4-weight yarn that you would like. This one here is a 61% cotton and 39% acrylic. I really love this yarn. And the hook size that I used is a 5.5mm crochet hook. You'll also need a pair of scissors and a needle to sew in your ends. I do crochet quite tight, so if you build it up the exact same number of rows that I did, yours will likely end up a little bit bigger. So if you'd like to do that, I recommend using maybe a 5mm crochet hook. And it's quite possible that it will end up a similar look and size to mine, just because I crochet so tight. But other than that, we'll get right into making this heart shawl. So to get started, we're either going to start with a magic ring or we're going to start with a chain to form a ring. I will show you how to do a magic ring real quick just because I prefer it and I love doing it. So you can hold the end of your yarn in between your thumb and your pointer finger and then wrap that working yarn around your two fingers, so your pointer finger and your middle finger, and form an X on top of those two fingers, and then use your ring finger to hold that working yarn out of the way. And we're going to bring in our hook, and I'm going to place it under this side of the X and over top of this side of the X here, grabbing that yarn while I pull it under. And while I'm pulling it under, I'm just going to twist my hook, which will form a loop on our hook. And then I'm going to grab that working yarn and chain 1. And that is a magic ring that we would work the following stitches into. So I prefer to start that way, and on my big one I did start that way, but you can also start with a slip knot on your hook. And I'm going to chain 4. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I'm going to slip stitch to that first chain that I made to form a ring. So I inserted my hook, I'm going to yarn over and pull that yarn both through that chain and through the loop on my hook. And you can see if you kind of pull it apart a little bit, that created a ring that we're going to work our stitches into. So I'm going to start by chaining 2, and that chain 2 does not count as a stitch. And if you did the magic ring as well, I showed you how to chain 1, but we'll actually chain 2 as well if we start with a magic ring. So starting with row 1, we're going to do our first set of stitches right into the center of this ring. So we're going to start by doing a puff stitch into the center of the ring. And to do a puff stitch, we yarn over, place our hook right into the center of that ring, yarn over, pull up a loop, and we want to do that 3 times total. So that was the first. Again, we yarn over, go right into the center of that ring, yarn over, pull up a loop, that was 2, and yarn over, back into the center of the ring, yarn over, pull up a loop, that's 3, and at this point you should have 7 loops on your hook. We want to yarn over and pull through all but that final loop. So we leave that final loop on our hook, and then you should have 2 loops on your hook at this point. We yarn over and pull through those 2 loops. And then we're going to chain 2. And we're going to do our second puff back into the center of that ring. So again, we yarn over, place our hook into the center of the ring, yarn over, pull up a loop. We want to do that 3 times total. That was the first. The second, we yarn over, back into the center of the ring, yarn over, pull up a loop. That was 2. And the third and final time, we yarn over, hook back into the center of that ring, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over. We go through all of the loops except for that final one. At this point, you should have 2 loops on your hook. We yarn over and go through both of those loops. And again, we chain 2. And we're going to do the third and final puff stitch into the center of this ring. So yarn over into the center of the ring, yarn over, pull up a loop. We do that 3 times total. 2 and 3. Yarn over and go through all of those loops except for that final one. Then we do a yarn over and pull through those final 2 loops on your hook. So that is row 1 complete. And at this point, I have a knot in my yarn, but that's okay. At this point, if you pull on that tail, that should close up that ring a little bit more. And even if it doesn't completely, don't worry about it, because when we're cleaning up the edges after we've built up our shawl, we're going to be placing more stitches in this to kind of turn the corner. So you don't need to worry about that now. But again, even if there's a little bit of opening like mine has, completely fine, because you will not see that later. So going on to row 2, we're going to start by chaining 2, and that chain 2, when we're completing a row and then turning our work and going on to the next row, it never counts as a stitch, so here or throughout the entirety of the pattern. And we're going to turn our work. And we're going to start the row, which is how we start every row going forward, by doing a puff, chain 2, puff, into this chain 2 space from the row prior that's in between the puffs. So again, we yarn over, go right into that chain 2 space, pull up a loop, do that 3 times total, yarn over, back into that chain space, pull up a loop, that was 2, and yarn over, back into that chain 2 space, pull up a loop, and yarn over and go through all of those loops on your hook, except for that final one. When you have those 2 loops on your hook, yarn over and go through those 2 loops. Again, we chain 2 in between those puffs and yarn over back into that chain 2 space, and we'll do our second puff. Yarn over, go through all the loops except for the final one, and then yarn over and pull through those final 2 loops. And for row 2 here, we're now going to chain 3. 1, 2, and 3. And we're going to jump over to this chain 2 space and do our puff, 2 and 3, and then our chain 2 that always comes between those puffs, and puff back into that same chain 2 space, 2 and 3, like so. And that is row 2 complete. So again, we're going to chain 2, turn our work, start the row the same where we do our puff, chain 2, and puff back into that same chain 2 space, and from this row going forward, after we do that second of the 2 puffs, we chain 2, and we're going to do that on each row going forward. So now we're going to skip over this puff. We're going to do a double crochet into each of these 3 chains. So jumping to the first chain, we'll double crochet into it, double crochet into that next chain, and double crochet into the 3rd and final chain here. And we've reached the puff, chain 2 puff on this side. So just like we started with those 2 chains, after that second puff, we are going to end with 2 chains prior to doing our puff, chain 2 puff. So now working right into that chain 2 space, we do our puff, chain 2, and puff. Like so. You can see we have the very start of our shawl, and we're going to chain 2, turn our work, start the same way, do our puff, chain 2, and puff all into that chain 2 space from the row prior. And then again, like I mentioned on the last row, we always do a chain 2 here. And then we double crochet into each of the next 2 chains from the row prior. So that will be the case for each row. Chain 2, double crochet in the next 2 chains. And then we are going to do our point on this row, our bottom point of the heart. So we want to have the opening fall right in that middle. So we're going to double crochet into the next stitch, and we're going to chain 1, skip that next stitch, which is the middle stitch of the row prior, and double crochet into the next stitch. And you can see we've made the very bottom of our heart, of the first heart. So again, we're going to finish the row in the exact same way on each row. It's double crochet into the next 2 chains over on this side. So that was the first one, jumping to that next chain, double crocheting into this chain, and then chain 2, and then do our puff, chain 2, and puff all into the chain 2 space from the row prior. That was between those 2 puffs in the row prior, like so. And then we're going to chain 2, turn our work. So going on to row 5, we'll start the same way, puff, chain 2, and puff, into that first chain 2 space, and chain 2. And then we double crochet into each of the next 2 chains, working those double crochets right into the chain itself. And then we want to, when we're increasing the number of spaces of our heart, so you can see this one has 1, we want 3 on the next one, 5 on the next one, 7 on the next one, and so on. We want to double crochet in each of the double crochets across until 2 stitches remain prior to that chain space. So on this row here, we're going to double crochet into this next double crochet, and you can see that I'm just going to untangle my yarn a little bit here. You can see that we've reached the final 2 stitches prior to that chain space. So that's where we're going to start doing the kind of mesh pattern. So we chain 1, skip that next stitch, and double crochet into that next stitch. And then we chain 1, skip the next stitch, which in this case is that chain 1 or the chain 1 space, and double crochet into the next stitch. And we want to do this until we have 3 of these openings total. So I'll do it one more time. Chain 1, skip the next stitch, and double crochet into the next stitch. And we've gone from 1 to the 3. And now we're going to double crochet into those next 2 chains. So finishing each row the same, where we double crochet into each of the 2 chains from the row prior. And then we do our chain 2, and then working into this chain 2 space, we do our puff, chain 2, and puff. My yarn keeps coming into the center of the camera view. So that was 1, 2, and 3. And that is row 5 complete. So going on to the next row, chain 2, turn our work, and I'm going to go ahead and do my puff, chain 2, puff into this first stitch, and then I will come back on. Okay, I did my puff, chain 2, puff. We're going to chain 2, just like every other row, and double crochet into those next 2 chains. So 1 into that first chain, 1 into that next chain, and we've reached our double crochets. So on this row, we want 5 spaces. 1, 3, now we want 5. So again, we're going to double crochet into each double crochet across, and I know on these beginning rows we're really only double crocheting into this first stitch, but I'm saying it like that because that's how it's going to keep working up, and eventually the number of double crochets here after those 2 chains is going to grow. So it's just been 3 so far, but eventually it's going to be more. So it's double crochet into each stitch until 2 stitches remain prior to that first chain 1 space. So on this row, it's just double crochet into that next double crochet, and then we've reached those 2 stitches. So we will start doing our chain 1, skip the next stitch, and double crochet into the next stitch. And we're going to repeat that across until we have those 5 chain 1 spaces. So chain 1, skip the next stitch, which is that chain 1, and double crochet into the next stitch, which is the double crochet from the row prior. And we'll chain 1, skip that next stitch, which is that chain 1 space, and double crochet into the next stitch. And we want to repeat that until we have 5 chain 1 spaces total. That's 3, chain 1, skip the next chain space, double crochet into the next stitch. So that's 4 of those chain 1 spaces. One more time, we chain 1, skip that next stitch, and double crochet into the next stitch. And there's the 5. So now we've hit our chain 2, or 2 chains here to end the row. So we're going to double crochet into those 2 chains. So 1 into that first of the 2 chains and 1 into the next chain. And then after doing that, we always do our chain 2 and do our puff, chain 2, and puff into this last chain 2 space. Like so. And going on to row 7, we'll chain 2, turn our work, puff, chain 2, puff into that first chain 2 space. And do our chain 2, jump to those 2 chains from the row prior and double crochet into each of those. So 1 double crochet into that first chain, 1 double crochet into that next chain. Again, we want to double crochet into each stitch until 2 stitches prior to that first chain 1 space. So again, on row 7, it's just going to be double crochet into that first stitch. We've reached the 2 stitches prior to the chain space. We will start our spaces. And the previous row had 5. Now this row, row 7, we want 7. So we did our chain 1. We're going to skip that next stitch and double crochet into the next stitch. And that was our first little space there. Chain 1, skip the next stitch, or the chain 1, double crochet into the next stitch. Chain 1, skip, double crochet into the next stitch. Chain 1, skip, and double into the next. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4. We want 3 more. Chain 1, skip that next chain 1 space, double crochet into the next stitch. Chain 1, skip that next chain 1 space and double crochet into the next stitch. And we need 1 more. So chain 1, skip that next stitch and double crochet into that next stitch. So we should have 7 chain 1 spaces here, and you can see each row it's going up. And we've reached these 2 chains on the opposite side of the row, so we will double crochet into each of those next 2 chains. And do the same, chain 2, and do our puff, chain 2, puff into this chain 2 space from the row prior. So I will go ahead and do that off camera. I'm also then going to chain 2, turn my work, and start the row with the puff, chain 2, puff into that first stitch. All right, I've started row 8 here with my puff, chain 2, puff. I'm going to chain 2, double crochet in those first 2 chains. There's 1 and 2, and this will be the final row where we increase the number of chain spaces. So on this one we want 9. The previous row had the 7. On this one we want 9. So again, we will double crochet in each stitch until those 2 stitches remain prior to that chain 1 space, and we will start doing the kind of mesh pattern. So we're going to chain 1, skip that next stitch, and double crochet into that next stitch, chain 1, skip, double crochet into the next, and I'm going to repeat this across until I have 9 total chain 1 spaces. All right, I have my 9 spaces. I've reached those 2 chains. I'm going to double crochet into each of those 2 chains. And chain 2 and do my puff, chain 2 and puff into the last chain 2 space here. And chain 2 and turn my work. And now this will be the first row where we're actually not increasing any of the chain 1 spaces. So I'm going to start the row by doing my puff, chain 2, puff, chain 2, double crocheting into each one of those chains, and then I'm going to double crochet into all 3 of these double crochets. All right, I've reached my chain spaces, so I'm just going to repeat what I did in the row prior. So I'm going to chain 1, skip the chain space, double crochet into the next stitch. So you can see here on the side, it did not increase again. That first chain 1 space here of row 9 is just right above the chain space from the row prior. So we're kind of working on the middle of the heart at this point. So I'm going to chain 1, skip the chain space, and double crochet into the next double crochet. Chain 1, skip the chain space, and double crochet into the next double crochet. And I'm going to repeat that across. So chain 1, skip, double crochet, chain 1, skip the chain space, double crochet into the double crochet from the row prior. I'm going to do that until I have, again, those 9 chain spaces, so it will be exactly the same as this row. Then I will double crochet into each of these double crochets at this end, double crochet into the next 2 chains, chain 2, do my puff, chain 2, puff into this final chain 2 space, and then I will come back on and we'll go on to row 10 together. Chain 2, turn our work, and for this row, or row 10, I believe it's row 10, 1, 2, yes, row 10, we're going to start with a puff, chain 2, puff, chain 2, double crochet into each of those 2 chains, and then I will come back on. And from here, I'm going to double crochet into each stitch until I reach that first chain 1 space from the row prior. So just double crocheting into each stitch. And this is the final one before that first chain 1 space. And then I'm going to repeat what I've been doing until I have 4 chain spaces. So we're going to chain 1, skip the chain space, double crochet into the next stitch. There was the first one, chain 1, skip the next chain, double crochet into the next stitch. That's 2, chain 1, skip the next chain space, double crochet into the next stitch. Whoops. There we go. There's 3 spaces. I'm going to do it one more time. Chain 1, skip the next chain space, and double crochet into the next stitch. So I have 4 chain spaces at this point. I want to, so we're not going to chain 1 or anything after this final double crochet. I'm going to double crochet right into the next chain space itself. So I'm not going into that chain 1, I'm going right into that chain space and doing a double crochet. And then we're going to just kind of mirror what we did on the opposite side. So we're going to start here with a double crochet into that next double crochet. So we have 3 double crochets in a row, and then I'm going to do my chain 1 and skipping a stitch and double crocheting into the next stitch until I have, again, those 4 chain 1 spaces. So chain 1, skip the next chain space, double crochet into the next stitch, chain 1, skip the next chain space, double crochet into the next stitch, and so on. Chain 1, skip, and double crochet into that next stitch. So I have those 3. We want to do it one more time. Chain 1, skip the next chain space, and double crochet into that next stitch. So we have those 4 chain 1 spaces, then 3 double crochets, then 4 chain 1 spaces again. And again, I'm going to double crochet into each of these double crochets across until I get to those 2 chains. I will double crochet into each of those 2 chains, then I will chain 2 and do my puff, chain 2, puff into the final chain 2 space. And then I'm going to chain 2, turn my work, do the puff, chain 2, puff into that first stitch, at which point I'll come back on. All right, I'm on row 11 now, and I just did my puff, chain 2, puff. I'm going to chain 2, and this will actually be the final row of the kind of mesh heart. So again, I'm going to double crochet into each of those next 2 chains, and I'm going to double crochet my way across until I reach that first chain 1 space. All right, I've reached that first chain 1 space, and I want my final 2 chain 1 spaces to be kind of right in the middle. So it's like it's rounding for the top of the heart. So I'm going to double crochet into this first chain 1 space. I'm going to double crochet into the next double crochet. And then I'm going to do my 2 chain 1 spaces. So I'm going to chain 1, skip that next chain 1, and double crochet into the next double crochet. And I'm going to do that one more time. Chain 1, skip the next stitch or the next chain 1 space, and double crochet into that next double crochet. So I have my 2, which is the very top of this side of the heart, and then I'm going to double crochet into each stitch. So the stitches count as either the double crochet or the chain 1 spaces, my way across here until I'm over on this side of the heart where I will do my chain 1 spaces over here. So we're going to double crochet into the next chain space and double crochet into the next 3 double crochets, two and 3, and we will double crochet into the next chain space, and we'll do one more double crochet, so that will be 7 in a row here in the middle of the heart, and then we're going to do our 2 chain 1 spaces. So again, we're right in the middle of this set of 4 chain 1 spaces where we'll do our 2 to finish off this heart. So chain 1, skip the next chain space, double crochet into the next double crochet, chain 1, skip the next chain space, double crochet into the next double crochet, and that's that kind of mesh heart all complete. So I'm going to finish off the row. We'll double crochet into the next chain space, and then I'm going to double crochet into each one of these double crochets across till I reach the 2 chains. I'll double crochet into each of those 2 chains and then do my puff, chain 2, puff, and then I'll chain 2, turn my work, and we'll go on to row 12 together, which will actually be the final row of this repeat for the heart. And the final row of this repeat is again starting with the puff, chain 2, puff, which we start each row with. And then chaining 2 and double crocheting into each of these 2 chains. And then we're just going to double crochet into each double crochet and chain 1 space all the way across. So I'll double crochet into all of these double crochets. When I hit the chain spaces, I'm going to do my double crochet right into the chain space, then into the double crochet, then into the chain space, into each of these double crochets, and so on. And we'll just finish off the row like normal, where we do 1 double crochet into each of these 2 chains, chain 2, and do our puff, chain 2, puff into this final chain 2 space. And each time after a double crochet across row, we start the 9 row repeat all over again. So just to reiterate those 9 rows, we chained 2 after that final row. We're going to turn our work, and the first row of the 9 row repeat is puff, chain 2, puff into this first chain 2 space. Then we're going to chain 2, double crochet into each of these 2 chains, and we're going to double crochet into each double crochet across until we hit the center stitch of this row. And to know which stitch is the center stitch, you can go down to the previous heart where you have the group of 3 double crochets in the center of this heart and follow that middle double crochet of the 3 all the way up. So we'll start at this one, following the double crochets up, and you'll know that that is the center stitch of this row. So feel free to mark it with a stitch marker if that makes you feel more comfortable, but I'll otherwise double crochet my way across until I reach that stitch. And when you've reached that center stitch, we're going to chain 1, skip that center stitch, and double crochet into the next stitch. And then we double crochet our way across these double crochets and each of those 2 chains. Then we chain 2 and do our puff, chain 2, puff into the chain 2 space at the end, and then we chain 2 and turn our work. And row 2 of the repeat is puff, chain 2, puff into the first chain 2 space, chain 2, double crochet into the next 2 chains, double crochet into each double crochet across until 2 stitches prior to that chain 1 space, at which point we will stop and we will start making our chain spaces again. The previous row we had 1, this one we want 3. So chain 1, skip the next stitch, double crochet into the next stitch. Chain 1, skip the next stitch, which is the chain 1, and double crochet into the next stitch. And one more time, we chain 1, skip the next stitch, double crochet into the next stitch. When we have our 3, we continue to double crochet into each of these double crochets across and into those 2 chains. Then we chain 2, puff, chain 2, puff into the final chain 2 space, and then we chain 2 and turn our work. And the next 3 rows of the repeat all start the same. We puff, chain 2, puff into that first chain 2 space, we chain 2, double crochet into the next 2 chains, double crochet across until 2 stitches prior to that first chain 1 space remain, and then we start doing our chain 1, skip a stitch, double crochet into the next stitch. Chain 1, skip a stitch, double crochet into the next stitch. And we started at 1, we have 3 on the previous row. On this row, we want to continue that until we have the 5 chain 1 spaces. The row after that, we'll continue that until we have the 7 chain 1 spaces, and the row after that, we will do the same thing until we have 9 chain 1 spaces. And once you have the correct number of chain 1 spaces, depending on the row, we double crochet our way across this side and into the 2 chains at the end. Then we chain 2, puff, chain 2, puff into the final chain 2 space. We chain 2, turn our work, and start the next row. So I'm going to go ahead and complete those next 3 repeat rows off camera, at which point I will be on a row where I have 9 chain 1 spaces across. And for the next row, we start the row the same, puff, chain 2, puff, chain 2, double crochet into each of the next 2 chains, and double crochet into each double crochet across until you hit your first chain 1 space. And then we chain 1, skip the chain 1 space, double crochet into the next stitch, and repeat that until we have, again, 9 chain 1 spaces. And once you have your 9 chain 1 spaces, we double crochet in each double crochet across and the chain 2, and then we chain 2, puff, chain 2, puff, chain 2 in this final chain 2 space and turn your work. And the 7th row of the repeat is puff, chain 2, puff into the first chain 2 space, chain 2, double crochet into each of the 2 chains, and double crochet in each double crochet across until you hit your first chain 1 space. Chain 1, skip the next chain space and double crochet into the next stitch until you have 4 of these chain 1 spaces in a row. And then we're going to double crochet into the next chain 1 space and double crochet into the next double crochet. So you'll have 3 double crochets in a row, and then we're going to start chaining 1, skipping the next chain space, and double crocheting into the next stitch until again we have those 4 chain 1 spaces on this side. And then we will continue to double crochet across, including in those 2 chains, and then we chain 2, puff, chain 2, puff into the final chain 2 space, and then we chain 2 and turn our work. And the next row of the repeat is puff, chain 2, puff into the first chain 2 space, chain 2, double crochet into the next 2 chains, double crochet into each double crochet across until you reach that first chain 1 space. And then we're going to double crochet into the first chain 1 space and into the next double crochet. And then we're going to chain 1, skip the next chain 1 and double crochet into the next double crochet. And we're going to do that one more time, so we have 2 chain 1 spaces in a row for the top of the heart. So chain 1, skip the next chain space and double crochet into the next stitch. And we want 7 double crochets in a row here until we get to the center 2 chain 1 spaces on the opposite side of the heart. So that was the first double crochet into the next chain space, that's 2, double crochet into the next 3 double crochets, that's 5 in a row. We want 2 more, so double crochet into the next chain space and the next double crochet. We've reached the center 2 chain 1 spaces on the opposite side of the heart. We're going to do our 2 chain 1 spaces. Chain 1, skip the next chain 1 and double crochet into the next double crochet. Chain 1, skip the next chain 1 space and double crochet into the next double crochet. And then we're going to double crochet again, just mirroring what we did on the opposite side, into that next chain 1 space and into each double crochet across on this side. And then we're going to double crochet into the 2 chains at the end here, chain 2, puff, chain 2, puff into the final chain 2 space, chain 2, and then we'll turn our work. And the final row of the 9-row repeat is puff, chain 2, puff into the first chain 2 space, chain 2, double crochet into each of those 2 chains, and double crochet into each double crochet and chain 1 space all the way across. When you get to this end, again, we double crochet into the final 2 chains, chain 2, puff, chain 2, puff into the final chain 2 space. And you can keep repeating those 9 rows until this piece is as big as you'd like it. So the one in the picture, I'm going to repeat it until I have 5 hearts total and finish on one of these double crochet across rows, but feel free to just keep repeating those 9 rows until it's as big as you'd like. And you can see the top will keep getting wider and wider and the height will get longer and longer. And once your piece is as big as you'd like and you've completed that double crochet across row, we're going to go ahead and do a very simple border around the entire piece. So again, at the end of that 9th row of the repeat, we will chain 2, turn our work, and we're going to start the round, because we're going to actually work around the entire piece the same way we've been doing. So we're going to do a puff, chain 2, and puff into that first chain 2 space. And then instead of chaining 2 at this point, we're just going to jump right over to those first 2 chains, and I'm going to single crochet into each of those 2 chains. So single crochet into that first chain, single crochet into that next chain. So again, we did not do a chain 2 like we've done every other row. We're just jumping to those first 2 chains, single crocheting into each of those 2 chains, and then I'm going to single crochet my way across the entirety of the top here. So it's 1 single crochet into each of these double crochets, and I'm going to work that all the way across. 1 single crochet into each double crochet all the way across, and I'll come back on when I get to these 2 chains. All right, I've made it over to the 2 chains on this side. Again, I'm going to single crochet into each of those 2 chains. So there was the first one, single crochet into the next one, and then I'm not going to chain 2 like I've done every other row. I'm just going to jump right to that chain 2 space between the puffs from the row prior and do our puff, chain 2, and puff into that chain 2 space. And then I'm going to turn my work here because we're going to work down this edge. So I'm going to chain 2 again after my last puff, and I'm going to single crochet back into that chain 2 space that we just did our puff, chain 2, puff in, and then chain 2. I'll single crochet right back into that same chain 2 space, like so. And that's that corner complete. So I'm going to chain 2, I'm going to skip over this puff or the side of this puff, and I'm going to do a single crochet into the next space here between these puffs. So going right into that, I guess it's technically that chain 2 space from that row, just going right into the space between those 2 outer puffs and doing a single crochet. And again, I'm going to chain 2 and repeat. Jump to the next opening between these 2 next outer puffs and do a single crochet right into that opening. And chain 2, jump to the next opening between these next 2 outer puffs and single crochet into it. And chain 2. And I'm going to repeat that down the entirety of this edge. Again, we just chained 2. We're going to jump to the next opening. So skip over this next puff and into that next opening between those 2 outer puffs. We do our single crochet. Chain 2. Skip that next puff. In the opening between these next 2 outer puffs, we do our single crochet, chain 2, and repeat. I'm going to repeat it down the entirety of this edge. All right, I'm getting close to this point here. I just wanted to show, it just kind of cleans up these edges. You can see the other one here, and this one I just find it makes it a little bit straighter and a little bit cleaner looking. So I did a single crochet here in this second row from where we started, chain 2 space. Again, I'm going to chain 2. I'm going to do my single crochet in this final opening here between these 2 outer puffs. And once again, I'm going to chain 2, and then remember I mentioned at the beginning we'd be working some stitches back into that opening at this point here. So I'm going to work 3 single crochets going right into that opening that those beginning 3 puffs are coming out of. So going right into that space, I will do 3 single crochets. There's 1, 2, and 3. And now we're going to turn again and work up this side. So we're just going to mirror what we just did on the opposite side. So I'm going to chain 2, jump to that first space between those 2 outer puffs here and do my single crochet. I'll actually get this beginning tail out of the way and sew that in afterwards. Chain 2, single crochet into this next opening, chain 2, single crochet, chain 2, single crochet, and we're just repeating what we did on the opposite side. So I'm going to work that up, single crocheting into that next space, chain 2, or by space I mean opening. I will repeat that all the way up this edge, and when I get close to where I started here on this final row, I'll come back on and show you how to finish everything off. All right, I'm just about back here to that final space between these 2 rows of puffs, and I did my single crochet. I'm going to chain 2, and I'm going to single crochet into this space that the puff chain 2 puff is coming out of on that final row. Just doing a single crochet, and then I'm going to chain 2, and I'm going to slip stitch right to the top of this first puff stitch. So if you look right at the top, you can see that V. That's the top of that puff stitch. I'm going to slip stitch to that puff stitch, and then I'm going to fasten off. So I chain 1, cut my yarn, pull that yarn through and pull tight, and we're all fastened off. So at this point, I'm just going to go around and get all of my ends sewn in. And I hope you love whatever it is you made, whether that be a triangle scarf or maybe a bandana or you made a large shawl. I hope you love it. And if you wouldn't mind subscribing and liking this video if you found it helpful, it's very much appreciated. But otherwise, you can check out all of my other crochet tutorials. I have lots on there, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!